I don't know about you, but over the last few years, I've got the distinct impression that masking tape has gone trendy and the price has gone through the roof, especially something like this Frogtape that comes in its own box. However, recently I found out that the edges of Frogtape are actually covered in a polymer that expands when paint hits it, in theory, stopping paint bleeding underneath the tape, so you end up with a nice clean edge, which may explain why it costs so much. But anyway, today I'm going to put this through its paces and actually ask, does it work? I was at a show recently where the guys from Frogtape had a stand and they were demonstrating their tape and demonstrating how the edges are actually covered in a polymer. And to do that, they had a little pot of the polymer that they'd put water in and actually solidified really quickly. If I find some video of it, I'll put it in at this point. It was quite an impressive demonstration, and they also showed how Frogtape creates a really clean line when you paint up against it. But they were using really smooth surfaces to demonstrate this on, which makes it easier for any masking tape, to be fair, to create a really clean line. So today I'm going to run through my experiments to see if this actually works. And the first thing I have to say, obviously, is I'm not being sponsored by Frogtape. They may not like the answer at the end of this video. I don't know. I need to do a little bit of investigation. I'm going to be putting this against Scotch tape and also the sort of tape that we all used to use year after year. You can still get this. It's really, really cheap, and it's the sort of stuff that you can pick up in your pound store, and it's the sort of stuff that we all used to use a few years ago, before these coloured ones came out. This is the Scotch 3M that tends to be in blue, and then obviously the Frogtape that is probably best known in green. You can get an orange one, which is like the low tack one. And on first appearances, I would say that these two are superior to the old cheap version. The actual tape feels better and feels more premium. But then they should be, because these modern coloured versions of masking tape are in a totally different price ballpark than the good old-fashioned bog standard masking tape. The last time I looked, this blue 3M 1-inch wide tape was just under £5 for a roll, and the Frogtape over £5 for a roll. So you can buy lots of rolls of this for one roll of the modern. However, how do they perform? Let's start doing a little bit of an experiment. And we'll start firstly on something really smooth, so everything's got a fair chance to perform well. Something smooth like glass. So this is my demonstration piece, which is just a small mirror that I can use for these sort of things. And some of you may say, when do you ever paint glass? Well, actually, when I'm painting around windows, I like to bring that paint round the window frame and actually a few millimeters onto glass. And how I get a nice straight line is always by using masking tape, like I demonstrated only a few weeks ago. So it's not uncommon to actually want a nice straight line on glass. So what we're going to do is going to use our 3 different masking tapes. Our cheap one, we've got the 3M here as well. Actually, I should put a little bit of a tab on that, just make it easier to take off. And then the famous Frogtape. Now, whenever you're using masking tape, you need to be able to take it off before everything dries. You can't leave it on. And the reason for that is that once everything has dried, you've potentially got a bridge across the masking tape to the paint. When you take the masking tape off, it can actually bring some of the paint off as well. Now, if you take it off when it's still wet, you don't have that problem. So you should always take masking tape off when the paint is still wet. You also need to push it down and just make sure that those surfaces are nice and in contact with whatever it's on. And for this test, I'm going to be using white paint, just because I think it shows up a little bit clearer. And all I'm going to do is to paint along the sides of each of these tapes. And before anything dries, let's just take this off and see what sort of lines we've got. That's not perfect by any means. There's a little bit of bleed on this first cheap one, even on the edges, even though I pushed it down really hard. This is the 3M tape. That's a little bit surprising as well. There's a couple of areas where it's bled as well. Let's have a look at the Frogtape. Now I must say that is actually the best out of the three. Just have a look at that. So this is the very basic standard tape. You can see it's bled all the way through to a certain extent. This is a 3M tape, but even that, there's areas here where it's managed to bleed underneath. It's a lot better than the original one, but even this isn't perfect on a solid piece of glass like this. Let's have a look at the frog. And very quickly, it's very obvious that actually this Frogtape line is almost perfect all the way along, or perfect enough that actually if you're looking at it from a metre or so away, you wouldn't notice it. It is better than the others for absolute sure. Really nice, crisp line. So I must say there is a clear winner, and definitely the Frogtape has come out a lot sharper than either of the other two. To be fair, the 3M blue tape did a pretty good job, but both of them were better than the bog standard tape that we all used to use. Right, let's move on to something a little bit more realistic where we're going to use proper paint. So this time I'm going to use a primed sheet of MDF and use both a brush and a roller just to see if there's any difference between the two. And once again, I'm going to push down each piece as hard as I can on either side, just to try to get the best possible bond between them to give them a fair chance. So this section I'm just going to paint. So half of it I'm going to roll and half of it I'm going to just paint with a brush just to see if there's any difference. You'll notice that the texture is completely different between the two, which is pretty normal if you're using a roller or brushing. And then once again, it's important that we take that tape off while it's still wet. If you don't, you've got that chance of it just pulling the paint off. You're going to get the best results if you pull off the tape when the paint is still wet. So let's start with the cheaper version. That's come out very similar to the glass actually. It's definitely no worse. And this is the 3M. Once again, better than the cheap tape, but there's still some bleed there. See what the Frogtape does. Well, once again, that is clearly the best. That is a really nice clean line on both sides. There's just one little section of bleed there. So once again, the Frogtape has clearly come out the winner on that one. Nice clean lines, no bleed underneath. I'm going to do the same thing again for the last time on something really textured, and the only thing that I could really find is a door that I did some other experiments with some time ago. So let's do the same again on a really strongly textured surface. So yeah, this is a door, or should I say a section of a door, that I've retrieved that I used a long time ago to demonstrate hinges and locks and what have you. And it's actually textured to make it feel a bit like timber, a bit like wood. So this is quite a textured surface. I've already primed it, but it's not flat by any means. So this is very much like replicating if you're going to be using tape on a door or even on a wall that's got like textured wallpaper, something like that, something that's not smooth like plaster. So let's just do the same thing very quickly here. I'll use a roller just to see which one performs the best. The texture on this is actually going left to right. So the worst case scenario for these tapes is actually to go like across the grain here. So I'm actually going to put them up and down rather than left and right, which means they're going to be challenged as much as they can be. Just going to rub those down really hard, making sure there's good contact there. And just roll, as I know now that actually there's no difference between using a brush and rolling. I might as well just roll, just because that's the quickest way of doing it. It's taken to that quite nicely actually. So once again, the big reveal, that is the cheapest masking tape. You can see wherever there's a bit of texture, the paint has managed to sneak underneath. That's a texture, that's texture, that's texture. So wherever texture is, the paint has obviously managed to sneak underneath, which in some ways isn't surprising. This is a 3M, which immediately you can see is a lot cleaner, totally different to the cheap one. But once again, we have got bleed in some areas where that texture is really heavy. And lastly, the Frogtape, which once again is clearly better than the other two. Immediately you can tell, and that is an incredibly nice line across there. So it may be that that polymer that's on the edges of the Frogtape is really doing its job. I'm surprised that there's no bleed on this because that texture is quite deep. And although I pushed it down really hard, I can't believe I've really got the tape following every contour, just especially when it's only like a millimetre wide. It's not going to go down and up again, but it's incredibly, incredibly straight line. So I am pretty impressed with that. And I must say, actually, out of the 3 tests that I've done, the Frogtape does come out the clear winner. The lines are precise and crisp, even compared to the Scotch tape as well. So maybe that polymer they put on the edge is really doing its job. So I'm pretty impressed with that. I must say, I thought the Frogtape and the 3M tape were going to come out with exactly the same results because both tapes feel exactly the same. However, after doing this, I can say that the Frogtape is a lot cleaner and a lot straighter and a lot more crisp. And that can only be the polymer they put on the side because there's no difference between the two. So in answer to the question, does it work? I would say absolutely, definitely. And I must say that's probably the best tape that I've ever used, and it's proved it to myself. One last thing to try, and this is a little tip that I've picked up before. If you don't want to spend all that money on Frogtape, but you still want that same result, there is another way of doing it with a little bit of decorator's cork. And I'm just going to finish on that because it might be something that you'll find comes in useful at a later date without spending extra money on this special type of tape. This is a great little tip to make the edges of your painted tape the best they can possibly be, irrespective of how good the tape is to start with. Once you've got your tape in position, get some decorating cork and wipe it over the edge of the tape to be painted. Now at this point, what you want to do is to take off 98% of that material, just leaving a really fine film next to the edge of your masking tape. And it wants to be really fine with almost nothing left. It means that within a few seconds, it's already started drying and you can paint over it. And with it in place, just paint like you normally would, and you will be surprised how crisp a line you can get using this method. So let's just have a bit of a close-up to see if that's helped the edge at all. This is the cheap old-fashioned tape, and you can see on the right is where I haven't put any cork. And on the left, the line on the left is where I smeared that cork and then painted over. When you compare the two, you can actually see the one on the left is a nice sharp line. Sharper actually than any of the tests we've done so far, even the one on the glass. And then once again on the 3M, I can see bleed on the non-prepared side, but where I smeared that decorating cork, it's an absolutely spot on sharp line. And as for the Frogtape, well, the Frogtape is pretty good on either side. Where I put the cork is just as good as where I haven't put the cork. So especially for the Frogtape, I would say that it doesn't actually make any difference because you know it's going to produce a sharp line one way or the other. So I think that is a nice little trick to make any masking tape lines even better. And having said that, if you're going to be using Frogtape, then it probably doesn't make any difference, because this immediately gives you a nice crisp line anyway. But if you're using the cheaper versions, then definitely it improves it. Just make sure you're using decorator's cork, not silicone, because paint doesn't stick to silicone. Decorator's cork will always say paintable, and just smear it over so it's the thinnest, absolutely thinnest of lines, and that will improve each one of your lines. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the video and for learning all about Frogtape, and the answer is yes, it does.